He thought he had just secured his luxury early retirement by spitting in the faces of the blue-collar peasants he despised. But he had no idea his glittering golden ticket was actually a $40 one-way pass to absolute unrecoverable financial ruin. Meet our antagonist. We'll call him Carter. He wasn't a builder. He was a disgraced corporate accountant who torched his own cushy career after wrapping his imported sedan around a street lamp. His blood alcohol level practically broke the breathalyzer. Desperate, broke, and drowning in legal fees, he ended up on our remodeling crew. A guy who couldn't swing a hammer before checking his manicured cuticles first. But instead of a slice of humble pie, Carter brought a towering, suffocating superiority complex to the job site every morning, usually arriving 30 minutes late, stinking of stale designer cologne and loudly complaining about the traffic. I had been sweating on this crew for 5 years. I knew the bones of these auctioned-off, forgotten houses better than I knew my own apartment. But to Carter, I was just a walking punchline. He'd stand there in his pristine, unscuffed work boots, leaning against a load-bearing wall he didn't know how to frame, and mimic my accent with this tight, condescending little smirk that made you want to put a nail gun through the drywall. He'd flick the dust off his flannel, a shirt he bought just to play construction worker, and loudly mock the fraying cuffs of my jacket. You could literally hear the wet, arrogant smack of his gum as he looked me up and down. His eyes dripped with an unspoken, sickening judgment, a look that said he was fundamentally better than me. He demanded the respect of a CEO, but out here, respect is paid in sweat, not swagger. The smirking and the cheap jokes were just noise until one blistering Tuesday afternoon. I had left my phone unlocked on the tailgate of the company truck to grab a fresh box of screws. When I came back, Carter wasn't just holding my phone. He was aggressively swiping through my private hidden Instagram account. His pale eyes widened with malicious glee, his greasy thumb frantically screenshotting old photos of me, smoking weed. He didn't just invade my privacy, he weaponized it. Before I could even rip the device out of his hands, he was already sprinting toward the foreman's trailer, practically salivating at the thought of getting me fired. He burst through the door, shoved the screen directly into my boss's face, and started screaming about liability and drug addicts. It was a beautiful, chaotic moment of pure, uninterrupted malice. But here's the one fatal detail Carter's massive ego was too blind to see. My boss wasn't just my employer. We had been drinking buddies and best friends for 8 solid years. In fact, he was the exact guy I was smoking with in half of those ancient, badly lit photos. The boss just stared at the glowing screen, then stared dead-eyed at Carter, letting a thick, suffocating silence fill the sweltering trailer. Carter stood there panting, fully believing he had just delivered a corporate kill shot. He didn't realize he had actually just signed his own psychological death warrant. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a punch. Physical retaliation is cheap, and frankly, it's illegal. Instead, I let a cold, dark clarity wash over me. I remembered a conversation I'd overheard earlier that week, where Carter bragged that if he ever hit the lottery, he'd quit this garbage job in the most humiliating way possible, just to prove he was better than us. That's when the architecture of his ruin snapped into perfect focus. Our company had a strict, ironclad policy regarding these abandoned auction properties. Whatever hidden treasure you pull out from behind the plaster and lathe, you get to keep. Carter knew this rule. He lusted after it. So I went online, spent $40, and ordered a heavy velvet pouch filled with incredibly realistic, heavy-gauge counterfeit gold doubloons. I found a rusted, oxidized metal lockbox buried in the back of a dusty antique shop, perfectly aged to look like it had been hidden during the Prohibition era. I carefully nestled the fake gold inside, sealing it shut with a healthy coat of grime and cobwebs. The next morning, before the sun even crested the horizon, I slipped into the master bedroom we were slated to demolish. I cut a clean hole behind the rotting baseboard, shoved the heavy metal box between the studs, and patched it up just enough to hide the seams. The stage was set. The trap was armed. All I had to do was hand Carter a sledgehammer, point him toward that exact wall, and wait for his insatiable greed to detonate his entire life.
The very next day, Carter sauntered onto the active job site 45 minutes after the morning whistle, clutching a sweating, overpriced iced macchiato like it was a royal scepter. He didn't offer an apology. Instead, he loudly cursed the city's infrastructure, claiming a minor pothole had knocked the alignment out of his imported sedan. He stood in the center of the gutted living room, kicking at a pile of splintered floorboards with the toe his pristine, unscuffed boot. When I handed him his safety glasses, he snatched them with a theatrical eye roll, loudly complaining that the abrasive dust in this slum was going to ruin his pores. He was entirely unfazed by his spectacular failure to get me fired the day before. In his narcissistic reality, the boss was just too stupid to recognize my insubordination, and Carter was simply the victim of a grand, blue-collar conspiracy. He spent the next 20 minutes leaning against a doorway, entirely avoiding the heavy lifting while lecturing me on my life choices. He casually sipped his coffee, watching me haul broken concrete, and told me that if I had applied myself in high school, I wouldn't be stuck doing peasant work. He bragged about his former corner office, his stock portfolio before the DUI, and how he was fundamentally engineered for greatness, not manual labor. He laughed, a sharp nasal sound that echoed off the bare studs, and asked if I had to put my cheap, threadbare work jacket on layaway. It was a masterclass in audacious entitlement. He was standing in the ashes of his own ruined career, yet he was still trying to burn everyone else down with the embers. I didn't yell. I didn't snap. I just slowly pulled off my heavy leather work gloves, letting the chaotic noise of the construction site fade into a dull hum. I leaned back against a stack of fresh drywall and took a slow, methodical sip from my thermos. The air was thick with pulverized plaster, but my heart rate was perfectly flat. I just watched him, cold, quiet, and completely detached. I could feel the rough grit of the concrete floor beneath my boots, anchoring me to reality, while Carter floated in his toxic bubble of delusion. The anger had completely evaporated, replaced by a dark, frozen anticipation. I was a fisherman, and the bait was practically screaming his name. To execute the trap flawlessly, I needed him to swing the hammer at that exact section of the master bedroom wall without a shred of suspicion. So I used his massive, fragile ego against him. I pulled out my phone, pretending to read a text message, and sighed loudly. I looked at him and said, "Boss just texted. He wants me to handle the master bedroom demo alone. Says it requires precision, and he doesn't trust the new guy not to crack the load-bearing beams. You're on garbage duty in the yard." The reaction was instantaneous. Carter's pale face flushed a deep, violent crimson. Being shoved onto garbage duty was bad enough, but being told he wasn't man enough to swing a hammer, that completely shattered his fragile ego. "Like hell I am," Carter spat, slamming his half-empty coffee onto a windowsill. He aggressively ripped the 20-pound sledgehammer from where it rested against the doorframe, his knuckles white with fury. "I'm not picking up your trash, you illiterate hack. I'll show that idiot foreman how a real professional clears a room." He stormed past me, deliberately shoulder-checking me on his way down the hall toward the master bedroom. I didn't flinch.
I just slowly turned on my heel, trailing a few paces behind him, my phone already discreetly recording in my chest pocket. I watched his back as he marched directly toward the specific stretch of rotting baseboard I had meticulously prepped hours earlier. Carter planted his feet awkwardly, raising the heavy sledgehammer with terrible off-balance form. He swung violently, driven entirely by spite and bruised pride, burying the steel head into the brittle plaster. Dust exploded into the air, coating his expensive clothes. He swung again, harder this time, completely intent on destroying the wall just to prove he could. But on the third brutal swing, the muffled crunch of crumbling drywall was abruptly interrupted by a loud, sharp, metallic clang. The vibration sent a shock wave up the wooden handle, making Carter drop the hammer with a sharp gasp. The dust began to settle in the slanting morning light. Through the haze, his widened eyes locked onto the dull, oxidized corner of a heavy metal lockbox, perfectly wedged between the exposed wooden studs. He turned on his heel to make his grand, cinematic exit, but I stepped squarely into the doorway, blocking his path. I didn't say a word at first. I just slowly raised my phone, the screen glowing brightly in the dim trailer. On it was the digital receipt for my $40 online purchase of zinc alloy theatrical props. I didn't blink. I just looked him dead in the eyes. You might want to take a closer look at your retirement fund, Carter. Check the bottom edge of those coins. He froze. His smug grin faltered as a sudden icy sliver of doubt pierced his chest. With trembling fingers, he plucked a single, heavy coin from the box, holding it up to the harsh fluorescent light of the trailer. The devastating silence that followed was an absolute masterpiece. I watched the exact second his entire delusional world caved in. All the color violently drained from his flushed face, leaving him a pale, sweating, hollowed-out shell as his eyes locked onto the tiny, unmistakable words "Made in China" stamped into the cheap metal. The profound weight of his destruction crushed the air out of his lungs. He had no job, no severance, a mountain of legal fees from his DUI, and he had just burned his last possible bridge to the ground for a box of worthless, counterfeit tin. Arrogance is a vicious compounding debt that eventually bankrupts the soul, because in the end, the undercover scales of justice always balance out. Carter dropped to his knees in the pulverized plaster, his manicured fingernails tearing frantically at the oxidized latch of the metal box. With a sharp groan of rusted hinges, the lid popped open, and a heavy cascade of dull golden light spilled into the dusty air. His eyes dilated, reflecting the meticulously crafted pile of heavy-gauge counterfeit doubloons I had buried there. He didn't test the weight. He didn't check for mint marks or tarnishing. He saw only exactly what his narcissistic ego demanded to see, a glittering, life-altering fortune that finally proved he was the wealthy, superior main character of the universe. He scooped up a handful of the cold metal, letting the coins clink together with a heavy, satisfying resonance, and completely abandoned the sledgehammer on the debris-covered floor. He didn't walk to the foreman's trailer. He marched. He kicked the flimsy door wide open, storming right past me and slamming the heavy lockbox onto my boss's folding desk. "I'm done," Carter screamed, his voice cracking with a hysterical, venomous joy. "I am absolutely done with this garbage company and you illiterate, bottom-feeding peasants. I'm rich." He pointed a trembling, victorious finger at my boss, calling him a pathetic loser destined to die in a cloud of drywall dust, before turning his hateful glare towards me. He sneered at my boots, mocking my worn-out clothes one last time, declaring that he was buying a first-class ticket back to the corporate world while we rotted in this auctioned-off slum. He was riding the absolute zenith of his delusion. My boss slowly leaned back in his squeaking chair, entirely unbothered by the theatrical explosion. He casually crossed his arms over his flannel shirt and looked Carter dead in the eye. "That's convenient," the boss muttered, his voice devoid of any emotion, "because I had your final paycheck printed on my desk this morning. You were already being fired today for chronic tardiness, liability risks, and blatant insubordination. Leave the hard hat, grab your tools, and get off my sight." Carter just threw his head back and laughed, a loud, arrogant cackle that echoed in the cramped trailer. He hugged the heavy lockbox to his chest, utterly invincible in his ignorance, completely unconcerned about losing a job he believed he had just spectacularly transcended.